Okay. All right. We're recording.
Welcome everybody to my presentation, Mass Incarceration, Why American Prisons Owe Their Cruelty to Slavery. This is based on the work of Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. I'd like to start out first with a monologue performance from the Modus Theater. This performance is in partnership with Boulder Public Library and Boulder Library Foundation. This is a monologue which is part of the programming of One Book, One Boulder, which this year focuses on the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. And I believe that I enabled optimization for video, but I'm not quite sure if I did that. So let me go ahead and once I start the video, you guys can tell me if you hear it. Actually, I'm going to stop share real quick. And I'm going to make sure that I did that. I'm sorry, guys. Yes, I did do that, so we're good. Joaquin Mobley is a monologuist for the Just Us Project. He's the Vice President of Community Works and a co-owner of Community Ties and the Community Barbershop based out of Colorado Springs. Joaquin helps those individuals who were recently incarcerated and or at risk at becoming incarcerated realize their true potential and manifest their limitless potential. Joaquin was once incarcerated for the better half of a decade and knows all too well how a helping hand, as opposed to a handout, can motivate one to succeed. A proud father of 3 beautiful girls, he refuses to let the next generation follow into the same footsteps and traps both him and his peers fell into.
Good evening. I'm Joaquin Mobley. I'm the Vice President of Community Works, also a local entrepreneur, also a proud father of 3, and a future husband to a beautiful young lady by the name of DC, who I'm dedicating this monologue to this beautiful evening. So without further ado, I want to thank you guys for being here, listening to me and my brother's plight, and hopefully these monologues can empower you to be a catalyst for change within these communities as we go through these trying times. So let's get to it. It's fall 2002, and I'm 18 years old. I'm full of strength and light. I tripped all the way from Washington Heights in Manhattan to Flushing, Queens, the last stop on the 7 train. Down to my last, I traveled to Home Depot to be interviewed for a job. Filled with hope, and I was cloaked in desperation. I walked in to meet my potential new employer. His name was Sheldon. We interviewed, and I killed it. I mean, I simply killed it. I'm sure Sheldon felt my hunger. I instantly detected his Caribbean accent and tried to find common ground, being that my father was from that part of the world, and I too was raised in that culture of hard work. He bought in on me working there. He told me how much I was going to love the job and that I would make good money, you know, all that good stuff you want to hear when you're about to start a new job. Sheldon then took my social security number and stepped behind his desk to run it through his system. At that time in my life, I would not allow myself to feel anything but confident as I typed in the 9 digits that ultimately would determine my possibilities. I insisted on the image of him returning to me with his hand held out, ready to shake, and that I would return to my abuela with the reassurance of a new job. I mean, where I was at in my life, I had to. I simply had to. See, earlier that morning, the stakes had been raised. I had been startled awake. The sound of bachata music, sobbing, police, sirens, and the soft conversation between two individuals outside my building discussing the terms and condition of the pre-purchase of narcotics. But those sounds, that's not what woke me. See, those noises in my neighborhood had become my background music, theme music, and in a weird way, it helped me sleep better. I could usually drown out even the loudest of those sounds, but that morning had been different. Something was wrong. Something was off. See, there was no sweet, beautiful aroma of fried yuca, eggs, onions that my abuela makes for me and my abuelo every morning. Nor did I hear the sound of Telemundo coming underneath my bedroom door. When I opened that door to my room, still halfway asleep, I discovered that the sobbing sound that I had grown immune to was coming not from outside, but from my family living room. It was my abuela who was sobbing. I ran to her side and knelt down in front of her. ¿Qué está pasando, abuela? She handed me two letters, one from my abuelo, stating that he would not receive his Social Security for another year, and another from public housing, informing my grandparents that because I was on probation for a felony drug conviction that happened when I was really a youth, I had to leave my home or my entire family would be evicted, left on the street. It's amazing. It's truly amazing, right? What a day brings and takes from us in our poverty-stricken communities. Just the night before, I had this feeling of stability, hope. After all, I had an actual interview for a job. Do you know how many applications an 18-year-old Black and Latin man has to fill out before they even get an interview? I made it up in my mind it was going to happen. My babies' mothers needed money for diapers and food, and I was going to have it. But now, looking at those letters and my abuela sobbing, the challenge was overwhelming. See, now I realize I just didn't need, enough money just to support my kids and, to start college. I now needed more. I needed enough for rent. I needed money for a security deposit, utilities, or I had to hold the possibility of being homeless again. And I had to figure out how to help my abuela pay her rent with no Social Security coming in. So once again, despite the vision that I had gathered for myself while incarcerated of getting a job and making it to college and staying out of the drug game, I was now having to consider going back into that lifestyle and possibly risking my freedom as well as my life and putting my family in harm's way. See, in the last year, I had already lost two friends. They were murdered over rivalry for selling territory. So trying to stay strong for my abuela, I kissed her and walked away. I kissed her and walked away to prepare for my interview at Home Depot in a new state of mind, one now heavy with threat and despair. But you can't let people see that and think that they will hire you. That's just not going to happen. So I masked it, and I began to mask it once I got in the shower. I showered, I dressed, and used every item of clothing I put on to build me up, hopefully to regain a little bit of strength and light so I could get on that train and feel it somehow just working out for me that day. So there I was, back sitting in Sheldon's office, practically praying, when his head finally reemerged from behind his computer. But I know something was off just by looking at his face. I can tell immediately that everything had changed. I was now dead to him, or at least untouchable. He wouldn't even look at me. He wouldn't even look at me in my eyes. The numbers had rolled out and I was officially unhireable. I started talking real fast, trying to regain my ground. I told him I could be on probation or, something like that. I needed this job for my kids. I shared with him, what I was up against economically. He was unmoved. And his response to my sob story was just, sorry. But I was not going home without a job that day. Please, Sheldon, listen. I'm trustworthy. I'm an honorable man. I'm asking for a shot, an opportunity, and a chance. He just looked at me, impervious to what I was going through, and asked that I leave the premises. Well, I left more than the premises. I left not only the premises, but I left New York. My mom lived out in Colorado Springs, and I hoped to find work through her connections and stay out of the drug game. When I got to Colorado, I was surrounded by nothing but job offers in the community. However, none of them were legal. Did you know that according to the Brookings Institute, a black man without a criminal record is less likely to get called back for a job than a white man who checked the felony box? It's ridiculous. So I made that trek. I went to prison, 2006, and I was given twice the time for the same crime as the two young white men who went up in front of the judge before me. That startled me awake, brought me back to reality, even more than the cries of my abuela. I was awake and angry with the injustice of it, and fierce with an intention of alchemy, to take all the steel, concrete, brutality, and disregard they gave me as DOC number 147388 and turn it into my own armor. I may have to fight to survive right now, but I will not be your entertainment. I am not your victim, and I will not let you make me into your victim. It's not an option. Every day, I gave myself a new challenge, a new task to help me keep my focus and my sanity. First, I built up my chest and biceps. Then I learned how to read and write in the language of my abuelos, Spanish. After that, I learned to read Arabic, the language of the black leaders in prison who were resisting with self-respect, self-love, dignity, and prayer. After I got my mind right, I re-enrolled in college and got several certifications despite the obstacles to getting my education in prison. And even with this arsenal of strengths, it was hard to stay out of prison. When I was finally released, they let me out with just $10 in my pocket. No fresh clothes, no hope. I almost didn't make it, despite my nearly 10 years of preparing for that very exact moment. But I did, and I'm here. And now I work to support other people coming out the prison system here at Community Works, guiding them as they take the skills they learned in illegal economies and transform themselves into entrepreneurs with legal opportunities, because this system wastes our brilliance. Thank you.
Oops.
Good evening.
Before I begin with Bryan Stevenson's writing, I did some research on the history. Did I lose my screen share? Nope, we're screen sharing still. I did some history on policing from Britannica.com. The first publicly funded organized police force with officers on duty full-time was created in Boston in 1838. Boston was a large shipping commercial center, and businesses had been hiring people to protect their property and safeguard the transport of goods from the port of Boston to other places. By the late 1880s, all major US cities had police forces. Fears of labor union organizers and of large waves of Catholic, Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants who looked and acted differently from the people who had dominated cities before drove the call for the preservation of law and order. At the same time, the late 19th century was the era of political machines. So police captains and sergeants for each precinct were often picked by the local political party ward leader, who often owned taverns or ran street gangs that intimidated voters. They then were able to use police to harass opponents of that particular political party or provide payoffs for officers to turn a blind eye to allow illegal drinking, gambling, and prostitution. But in the South, however, the economics that drove the creation of police forces were centered not on the protection of shipping interests, but on the preservation of the slavery system. Some of the primary policing institutions there were the slave patrols, tasked with chasing down runaways and preventing slave revolts. And here I've added the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It was passed on September 18, 1850 by Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of the Compromise of 1850. The act required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. Now we'll begin with the writing of Bryan Stevenson. Slavery gave America a fear of Black people and a taste for violent punishment. Both still define our criminal justice system. Mike, can you mute yourself?
Yeah, sorry, just a second.
Several years ago, my law office was fighting for the release of a Black man who had been condemned at the age of 17 to die in prison. Matthew was one of 62 Louisiana children sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for non-homicide offenses. But a case I'd argued at the Supreme Court was part of a 2010 ruling that banned such sentences for juveniles, making our clients eligible for release. Some had been in prison for nearly 50 years. Almost all had been sent to Angola, a penitentiary in Louisiana, considered one of America's most violent and abusive. Angola is immense, larger than Manhattan, covering land once occupied by slave plantations. Our clients there worked in fields under the supervision of horse riding, shotgun-toting guards who forced them to pick crops, including cotton. Their disciplinary records show that if they refused to pick cotton or failed to pick it fast enough, they could be punished with time in the hole, where food was restricted and inmates were sometimes tear gassed. Still, some Black prisoners, including Matthew, considered the despair of the hole preferable to the unbearable degradation of being forced to pick cotton on a plantation at the end of the 20th century. I was fearful that such clients would be denied parole based on their disciplinary records. Some were. I've added an extra slide here on another prison, the Ferguson Prison for young men ages 17 to 21 in Huntsville, Texas in 1968. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration of any nation on earth. We represent 4 or nearly 5% of the planet's population, but 20% of its imprisoned. In the early 1970s, our prisons held fewer than 300,000 people. Since then, that number has grown to more than 2.2 million, with 4.5 million more on probation or parole. Because of mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes laws, I found myself representing clients sentenced to life without parole for stealing a bicycle or for simple possession of marijuana. And central to understanding this practice of mass incarceration and excessive punishment is the legacy of slavery. It took only a few decades after the arrival of enslaved Africans in Virginia before white settlers demanded a new world defined by racial caste. The 1664 General Assembly of Maryland decreed that all Negroes within the province shall serve durante vita, hard labor for life. This enslavement would be sustained by the threat of brutal punishment. By 1729, Maryland law authorized punishments of enslaved people, including to have the right hand cut off, the head severed from the body divided into 4 quarters, and head and quarters set up in the most public places of the county. And I've added a bit of research on Maryland history from maryland.gov. Although Maryland colonists practiced Negro slavery as early as the 1640s, they did not give it legislative sanction until 1664. There were several reasons why the first slave law should have come at that particular time. Perhaps the most important factor was the rapidly rising number of Africans in the colony. In 1640, the Black population had been a mere 20 individuals in a non-Indian population of about 600. In 1660, the number of Blacks had risen to 760 out of 8,500. Thus, during those 2 decades, the ratio of Blacks to whites had narrowed from 1 Black in 30 whites to 1 in 10. The African Americans were a more visible element in society than they had formerly been. Furthermore, by the 1660s, Maryland was firmly committed to a tobacco staple economy that demanded an abundance of cheap labor. Now back to Bryan Stevenson's writing. Soon, American slavery matured into a perverse regime that denied the humanity of Black people while still criminalizing their actions. As the Supreme Court of Alabama explained in 1861, enslaved Black people were capable of committing crimes, and in that capacity were regarded as persons. But in most every other sense, they were incapable of performing civil acts and considered things, not persons. The 13th Amendment is credited with ending slavery, but it stopped short of that. It made an exception for those convicted of crimes. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, where if the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. After emancipation, Black people, once seen as less than fully human slaves, were seen as less than fully human criminals. The provisional governor of South Carolina declared in 1865 that they had to be restrained from theft, idleness, vagrancy, and crime. And I added a slide here. In 2018 in Colorado, we amended our Constitution. In the Constitution of the state of Colorado, amend Section 26 of Article 2 as follows. Slavery prohibited. There shall never be in this state either slavery or involuntary servitude. And the last sentence was struck from the Constitution. Laws governing slavery were replaced with Black codes governing free Black people. making the criminal justice system central to new strategies of racial control. These strategies intensified whenever Black people asserted their independence or achieved any measure of success. During Reconstruction, the emergence of Black elected officials and entrepreneurs was countered by convict leasing, a scheme in which white policymakers invented offenses used to target Black people. Vagrancy, loitering, being a group of Black people out after dark, seeking employment without a note from a former enslaver. The imprisoned were then leased to businesses and farms where they labored under brutal conditions. An 1887 report in Mississippi found that 6 months after 204 prisoners were leased to a white man named McDonald, dozens were dead or dying. The prison hospital filled with men whose bodies bore marks of the most inhuman and brutal treatment, so poor and emaciated that their bones almost come through the skin. Anything that challenged the racial hierarchy could be seen as a crime, punished either by the law or by the lynchings that stretched from Mississippi to Minnesota. In 1916, Anthony Crawford was lynched in South Carolina for being successful enough to refuse a low price for his cotton. In 1933, Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched near Birmingham for daring to chastise white children who were throwing rocks at her. It's not just that this history fostered a view of Black people as presumptively criminal. It also cultivated a tolerance for employing any level of brutality in response. In 1904, in Mississippi, a Black man was accused of shooting a white landowner who had attacked him. A white mob captured him and the woman with him, cut off their ears and fingers, drilled corkscrews into their flesh, and then burned them alive, while hundreds of white spectators enjoyed deviled eggs and lemonade. The landowner's brother, Woods Eastland, presided over the violence. He was later elected district attorney of Scott County, Mississippi, a position that allowed his son, James Eastland, an avowed white supremacist, to serve 6 terms as a United States Senator, becoming president pro tempore from 1972 to 1978. This appetite for harsh punishment has echoed across the decades. Late in the 20th century, amid protests over civil rights and inequality, a new politics of fear and anger would emerge. Nixon's war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, children tried as adults, and broken windows policing. These policies were not as expressly racialized as the Black codes, but their implementation has been essentially the same. It is Black and brown people who are disproportionately targeted, stopped, suspected, incarcerated, and shot by the police. Hundreds of years after the arrival of enslaved Africans, a presumption of danger and criminality still follows Black people everywhere. New language has emerged for the non-crimes that have replaced the Black codes. Driving while Black, sleeping while Black, sitting in a coffee shop while Black. All reflect incidents in which African Americans were mistreated, assaulted, or arrested for conduct that would be ignored if they were white. In schools, Black kids are suspended and expelled at rates that vastly exceed the punishment of white children for the same behavior. Inside courtrooms, the problem gets worse. Racial disparities in sentencing are found in almost every crime category. Children as young as 13, almost all Black, are sentenced to life imprisonment for non-homicide offenses. Black defendants are 22 times more likely to receive the death penalty for crimes whose victims are white rather than Black, a type of bias the Supreme Court has declared inevitable. The smog created by our history of racial injustice is suffocating and toxic. We are too practiced in ignoring the victimization of any Black people tagged as criminal. Like Woods Eastland's crowd, too many Americans are willing spectators to horrifying acts as long as we're assured they're in the interest of maintaining order. This cannot be the end of the story. In 2018, the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit I direct, opened a museum in Montgomery, Alabama, dedicated to the legacy of slavery, and a memorial honoring thousands of Black lynching victims. We must acknowledge the 400 years of injustice that haunt us. I'm encouraged. 500,000 people have visited. But I'm also worried because we are at one of those critical moments in American history when we will either double down on romanticizing our past or accept that there is something better waiting for us. I recently went to New Orleans to celebrate the release of several of our Angola clients, including Matthew, men who survived the fields and the hole. I realized how important it is to stay hopeful. Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. There were moments of joy that night, but there was also heaviness. We all seemed keenly aware that we were not truly free from the burden of living in a nation that continues to deny and doubt this legacy, and how much work remains to be done. So Bryan Stevenson is currently advocating through his criminal justice reform for the death penalty, or advocating for removal of the death penalty, children in adult prison, wrongful convictions, excessive punishment, and prison conditions. So I'd like to end this presentation the way I began, with another monologue. This is from Modus Theater, again, The Justice Project, Stories from the Front Lines of the Criminal Justice System. This is by Brandon Wainwright, the gentleman on the right.
Well, trying to live, I lost my life. At birth, I was named Brandon Marlowe Wainwright. That is the name my mother used, as well as the teachers at school. On the street, my name is Doug, D to the UB, or you can call me Young Black King. But on a serious note, let me tell you that 90% of people from my hood are considered failures. And I'm supposed to act like I can't be part of that 10% because of the way you think of me, and because my ways are often too ignorant. I have a young mother, young father, brothers and sisters at home, barely food in the fridge or water, depending on if it was on. I'm surrounded by old heads and youngins walking around with handguns, and they won't hesitate to let me know what they think of my honor roll ass if I can't fight. School is kind of a sanctuary, if you will, or safe haven. It's like, look, I can be myself. I can be a nerd. I can be a thespian. I can do sports. I can do whatever I want while I'm in school because I'm living my life. This is how I want to live. This is how I want to live. But outside of school, I put on a whole other mask. I fight, and I fight, and I fight. I am Dub, and me and my gang, we do what we do. Big time shoplifting, small time drug dealing. Like I said, in my hood, 90% of the people are considered failures, and they are the people whose approval I need in order to survive. And you might not like the guys I hang out with, but they are the only ones who have my back, and I have theirs. Oh yeah, I do. And this is not the life I want to live, but it is the life I have to live. Things become harder when I turned 16. I stood up for my brother against my father, and for that, I am out of the house. I'm no longer his mouth to feed. From 16 on, there isn't anyone giving me a roof, clothes, food. I have to go and do that with the help of my gang. And that's why I said I had to live. I had to find a way. And then I was losing my life because at a young age, trying to be an adult, you know, you can't really have a life. You got to kind of give that up. But still, I stayed a star student, honor roll, state champ, athlete, blah, blah, blah. Against all odds, I still kept my cards. I kept my cards, man. And by my senior year, it is clear I'm going to be part of that 10%. That makes it. That makes it. I mean, women, money, cars. I'm headed for the NFL. I have a full ride sports scholarship. I'm choosing the offers. I'm even going to be prom king. Who would have thought, right? So with all this heading my way, did anyone ask me why on January 12th of my senior year, I shoplifted? Let's just say I robbed 6 video stores in one night. 6 in one night. Instead of working hard to prove what a terrible criminal I was, did anyone consider I might also have been a young man having a hard time and needing some help? Did anyone sit in a circle with me and say, Brandon Wainwright, what were you thinking? 6 stores in one night? You must have known you was gonna get caught. For a few $1,000s, you threw away a $100,000 full ride college scholarship. You were going to be part of that 10%. Why? Why, Brandon? No, they didn't ask. They charged me with robbery. They kicked me out of school. They made an example of me. Nobody acknowledged that I had to be the best at being Brandon Wainwright, star athlete, star student, to make the 10% and thrive. And that I had to be the best at being Dub, to have shelter, food, and survive. They didn't acknowledge that. I was locked in a terrible split that put surviving and thriving at war with each other. They acted like Brandon, the high school vice president of the future business leaders of America, was alive. And that I had finally shown my true colors, Black. As if I was by nature essentially a criminal. Nobody in the justice system or the school system cared enough to even ask why I did what I did. Nobody. And well, yeah, it's a long story. It's a very long story. But let me just say, at that moment, at the moment I made that decision, I was exhausted. I was exhausted by the fight, and I didn't even care. You wanna know why I didn't care? Because that night I was hurting. I didn't feel any love. You know why I didn't feel love? Because I wasn't getting it from the parents who I thought had made me their son. They didn't come to my games. They didn't care I was on the honor roll, that I was going to college, that I had a scholarship. And why wasn't I getting that love? Because I was living on my own at 16, away from the only home I had known. And because my parents were young, they hadn't grown up with much love either. And they were busy fighting poverty, fighting racism, fighting their own ignorance, fighting to survive themselves. And tired of fighting with me and struggling with how to raise a young Black son in a place where the streets have so much power and the parent has so little. Or you can just knock it down to the fact that where I was raised, you're either born with it or you're born without it. And no matter what you apply that to, and I thought I'd rather be caught with it than without it. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. I needed money to live, for food, for shelter, for clothes on my back. And maybe to graduate looking nice in that prom king suit I was gonna buy with some of that cash. Yeah, it's a long story that you slam into one righteous move with your gavel, and you would have to actually care about me to understand. So instead of any help and support dealing with the challenges I faced, I got a lifelong label as a criminal and more obstacles to overcome. I was already tired and the fight just got harder. But I'm not giving up. I have two beautiful daughters, London and Anina. I have a handsome 5-month-old baby boy named Nasir, which means helper or one who gives victory. So everything that I do from this point on is for my kids and for my family, because they would never go through what I went through, because I'm always gonna be here, whether physically or spiritually, I'm always gonna be here.